And I think following Adriana, I'll stop at a certain point and give you a little bit of my personal journey, because there is an intersubjectivity to whatever we do, a subjectivity, and I want to share with you. So let's start with the challenge of teaching and assessing this intercultural language learning and communication. So that's what ILLC is. You may have probably seen that acronym before. It's knowledge, skills, and dispositions. And since I am a teacher educator, we call those the KSDs. And I'll give you a background on where we are with those and what they are. And I am both, because I'm in a large teacher ed program in California, you must know, maybe you don't, that the California State University, we actually educate 1/9 of the teachers in the United States. And when I first came, we had an immense enterprise of like 500 teachers a year were graduating. And the Masters in TESOL, which I started, was sort of like the upper level or the frosting on this huge cake. And our challenge as a TESOL educator is to teach this repertoire of intercultural communication content along with language. Many of our students come from abroad. And then we have, as teacher educators, to use our own skills in this area to teach this. So we really have to practice what we preach and become intercultural educators. And so our ILLC challenge is that developing this intercultural perspective is experiential. It has to be learned in context. And we've been struggling with the experiential nature of the assessment, in that you cannot assess outside the context of the actual interaction. But it also must be dynamic. And I'm so grateful that Adriana gave you an introduction to dynamic assessment for those people that aren't on board with that. You have to measure the current competence as well as the learning potential. And so we'll be getting into a little more what that takes. So let me step back and tell you where we are on these KSDs, especially the knowledge and skills. And I'm humbled that people in the room, for example, Alvino, have been struggling with this for so many years. And we certainly stand on the shoulders of giants as we move this forward. But in California, when I started early in my career in 1993, the California Cross-Cultural Language Academic Development Credential came, in which we were attempting to, the state of California designed a teacher credential program that every teacher in California would be an ESL teacher and an educator of culturally and linguistically diverse students. So we never had an ESL pull-out kind of cadre in the schools. Every teacher, according to the CLAD credential, would be responsible for not only ESL methodology, but academic content mediation, as well as cultural awareness and cultural knowledge. And with a certain degree of foresight, I say humbly, I was the one that wrote the CLAD book. And so at one point, my book was used in every teacher ed program in California to do this job. And I feel, and my colleague Kathy Weed was associated at that time with that book, that we really did update the book. It's in the 6th edition now, continually develop the knowledge and skills that we felt teachers needed. Remember, as teacher educators, we are not just educating teachers, we are educating the students of teachers. I mean, teacher educators have failed if the culturally and linguistically diverse population of California is not achieving and is not well educated. So we have to reach through and mediate that possibility in our teachers that they will accomplish those goals. And the students will, in their presence, do that learning. So because of that, we are in a College of Teacher Education. The National Council for Accreditation of Teacher Education, or NCATE, is our accreditor. And the KSD part of the dispositions part of the KSD really comes from the NCATE pressure to accredit, I should say, our colleges. So luckily in my career, I've been afforded the great privilege, really an honor, of both extensive and intensive involvement with educators who are working in these intercultural contexts. The context of San Bernardino is that 50% of San Bernardino County is Hispanic. 25% of the learners in the schools are English learners at various levels. So we're an ESL Central there. It's very, actually, and we're doing a pretty good job. San Bernardino is a bilingual community. It's one of the first communities in California that has accepted the sobriquet of being a bilingual community. We have dual immersion schools, quite a few of them, and actually, according to the census, San Bernardino is the #1 city in the United States that every neighborhood is more integrated than any other city in the United States. We are the most integrated, culturally diverse city in the United States. So there is a lot of work to be done. And then in the TESOL in California, as well as the TESOL Association internationally, has both the intercultural interest group and the intercultural interest section. And those started around the year 2000. So we've been, and also my book, Strategies for Teaching English Learners, has a very robust orientation to culture. So we've been doing the knowledge and skills across the years. And my cross-cultural teaching course has been continually renovating and pushing forward the K and the S part. But I feel that the disposition part really, in the area of dispositions, there's really, I think, grave theoretical and empirical gaps in the development of the construct, and also how would you teach that. So it's a complicated field of cultural competence. Expanding the learner's repertoire, responses, and attitudes, and then measuring it, it's really quite a struggle at this point. So I thought I would stop and talk about the idea of dispositions. You can have all the knowledge and skills that you want, but if you're not disposed to use them, it's not going to go anywhere. And the disposition is really reaching down inside yourself to want to do what's necessary to have culturally and linguistically diverse learners learn. And so that's really the struggle. Not only is it a struggle, but as I said, the currently under-theorized nature of this KSD-associated sociocognition is really, I think, holding us back in some ways. So we want to frame the skill set that's involved in the ILLC, but the cognitive demands are really complex and really, I think, fraught with undertones of loosely useful constructs. Culture shock, I find that a very loosely useful construct. Acculturation, assimilation, they take a long time to explain, but to want to be part of the doing of them, I think, is a tremendous struggle. Now, Michael Cole once said that mind is interiorized culture and culture is exteriorized mind. So if you think about that, no wonder culture is complicated, because it's as complicated as the human mind is. It's just the external and artification of the human mind. So trying to grapple with the social cognition that's required for this endeavor, it's really, I think, still in its infancy. So I think we're lucky to be where we are and when we are in doing this struggle. So we're trying to assess the dynamic nature of it. So I go back to dynamic assessment. The original tools that I learned was instrumental enrichment from Ferris Stein. And also his learning potential assessment device was one of the first dynamic assessments. And you have to go through, it's proprietary, you have to go through weeks and weeks of training. And luckily I was able to actually meet Ferris Stein and spend quite a bit of time with him. So those of you who have not heard of Ferris Stein, he was born in Romania, attended the Teachers College of Bucharest, studied psychology, and then was forced to flee from the Nazi invasion. He settled in Palestine, teaching the child survivors of the Holocaust. And he studied under Piaget. He attained his PhD in developmental psychology at the Sorbonne. And in the 50s and 60s, he was the director of Aliyah in Europe, meaning he was systematically assigning candidates for immigration to Israel from Europe. And he discovered when standardized IQ tests were administered, at least to his original population of Moroccan Jewish children, they did poorly. But if they were guided through the teacher answer format by a mediator, the child's performance improved dramatically. And so for him, the key to meaningful instruction was the mediated relationship. And since the 70s, he's worked in Israel. He just died in 2014. Imagine, he was repatriating children off the streets of Europe who had lost their parents, were living out of garbage cans, and didn't even know what an uncle was. They had no cognitive structures that had to be mediated. And so, and then when they were, through his instrumental enrichment, doing spectacularly in learning, the psychologists would criticize they must have not been that hard off since you did so well. So he went with Down syndrome. You can't say the Down syndrome child is not benefiting, because he was one of the first to have no upper limit for Down syndrome. In fact, one of his students, a Down syndrome student, won the 50th anniversary stamp design for Israel. And so he's had a tremendous effect on the world. So what is instrumental enrichment? It's a series of workbooks. And so the workbooks are here. And just to give you an example, I brought 2 of them here, and we're going to be looking at the cognitive map of family relations, because I thought it would be easier for everyone to see what family relations are. But they have temporal relations. You can see comparisons, analytic perception. It's quite thorough in the sense of being cognitive remediation. He's gone on to brain damage and other kinds of cognitive remediation with these instruments. So each workbook has what they call the cognitive map. And the cognitive map is actually part of the analysis of the actual instrument for the mediator. So you can see the cognitive map looks something like this. It's 2 pages worth in the instrument. And it can be applied to prototype both as curriculum and the associated assessment. So I think we're going to take a look at what that means. So we're looking at family relations. The content is kinship for a vehicle for understanding these conceptualized relationships between people. The modality is both verbal, symbolic, graphic, tabular, and scientific. So you can see in the modality, there's tables, there's graphs, there's, of course, the schematic. The original is the family tree. So this has a very wide table, a very wide modality, range of modalities. It goes through input, elaboration, and output. So there's sort of an information processing phase. And, you know, psychologists since Sternberg have talked about intelligence as information processing. He lists 7 kinds of input, 6 kinds of elaboration, and 3 kinds of output. In terms of the cognitive operations, it's very wide. There's identification, encoding, decoding, differentiation, integration, representation, inferential thinking, analogical thinking, inductive and deductive reasoning. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. And then the level of complexity, it's very low in the early pages. As additional elements and relationships are added and less familiarity with the terms, it becomes more complex. The level of abstraction is from medium to high, and the level of efficiency, there's a great effective practice. Once you learn a small family tree, you can increase your efficiency in thinking about the rest of it. So I'm going to be mapping the intercultural effectiveness scale from the Kozai group. And you know, the Kozai group is an outgrowth in Portland and Milton Bennett's enterprise. So you can imagine it's been informed by that, but it's actually administered by the Kozai group. And so how would my students do it? My students would, I would enroll them. They would pay through PayPal, and it cost them $12 to take this. And it's about how effective they're going to be as an intercultural educator. So I've been using it. This is the 3rd year I've used it in my cross-cultural teaching class. And so they want to know how well individuals will work and interact with people who are culturally different than them. So we're pretty familiar with that as an IC effectivity definition. So those who are interculturally effective, according to this instrument, are more comfortable in novel situations, have accurate understandings of what is appropriate reaction, can inspire trust in others and motivate those they work with to higher levels of performance. And so again, the construct of intercultural effectiveness is worked on by this theorization underlying the instrument. And so the scales, there's 3 large scales: continuous learning, interpersonal engagement, and hardiness. Each one is informed by 2 subscales. And so, for example, here, the continuous learning subscales are self-awareness and exploration. The interpersonal engagement is, do you have a global mindset, and how interested are you in forming relationships with other people? Hardiness is how much you have positive regard for differences and how emotionally resilient you are. Now, this is self-report. People might have problems with the self-report scale, but remember, the entire enterprise is self-driven. We're trying to get the dispositions of you as a self. How are you going to do this? So if you think about it, there's 3 parts to making this work. The first is the whole enrolling online, paying through PayPal. Your invitation goes into junk mail. So it takes about a week and a half of a 5-week course, imagine, to get people enrolled. But I try to get them to help each other. I try not to mediate that too much. I don't want to create dependency, or it'll never stop, trust me. But taking the inventory online, there is no mediation. They do it, you know, they don't ask for help. It's an individual kind of me and the inventory kind of thing. But interpreting the score is the mediated learning experience, and this is the most exciting part of it. And it's a chance for myself as a mediator to really make a difference. So taking the inventory online, you might think that is somewhat mediated, but there really is no known cognitive map of technology mastery. Have you noticed that? There's no known cognitive map of computer mastery. I'll just leave that because I'm not going to argue with that. But taking the test online is not mediated. And so here, I'm going to make a brief cognitive map of taking the inventory. And so as you take the inventory as a user, you have to introspect, you have to look at your capacity for continuous learning, self-awareness, interpersonal engagement. You have to really introspect and report yourself well. And I think that's pretty robust. When people show me the answers, I think, as far as I know the student, it fits them pretty well. The modality is entirely verbal. There are no symbols or graphs in the report. It's question, answer kind of thing. The input phrase, you have to have a clear perception of the meaning of the questions in a layman's interpretation of terms. And you have to have some freedom from prior negative associations. I mean, if you're crippled with a poor self-image about everything, maybe that would influence your reaction. But for most adults, their consistency of their self-image is actually pretty good. My users are probably in their late 20s and early 30s. They know themselves pretty well by then. The elaboration is you have to keep the constancy of self-image over the duration of the survey, and the factors are randomized. So I don't think you can game the assessment that much. And you actually force choices to create these factors, so you have to output in a consistent way. Most people are good test takers by now in that sense. So taking the inventory, the operations are self-analysis, identification, decoding the question, differentiating the terms, retrieval and representation of your prior cultural incidents in your own memory, selective self-assessment of your own personality traits, dispositions, and tendencies. So there are quite a few cognitive operations as you take the survey. The level of complexity ranges from low to medium depending on how you construe the item. It's higher with the interaction or projection element. The more experience you have, the more you have to look back on things, and the number of prior relationships you had, and how the item resonates with you as an individual. So it's not simplex. The level of abstraction is from low to medium. The level of efficiency, I don't think there's any effective practice because it's a one-time administration. I guess you could take it again. I guess you could take it as many times as you wanted to put $12 down, but there wouldn't be a lot of effective practice in this. And so as you interpret the score, I think this becomes the interesting part. As part of this $12, you get this quite elaborate booklet with your scale score, and then you're asked to map the scale score onto these 3 dimensions, and then they actually have profiles about what the different dimensions mean. And so if you're quite a global educator, for example, your profile would be a perfect triangle in the sense that you would be equally good in all these areas. If you're, and I have to say, when I took it, I kind of gamed it and got this. So I guess you can game it, But then at the beginning when I was learning this, I got my family to take it. And to my chagrin, my son, who's 23, turned out to be nothing. Didn't care, didn't want it, and was not going to be resilient. That's called the traditionalist. So that's built into the system. He could find himself there. And so there's a variety of different. Now that is the mediated learning experience, because getting language teachers to map things on dimensions, numbers, they kind of fall apart. I have a wide range. Because in my master's program, you can take a master's in TESOL when your major was dance. You could have abandoned math in high school. So these results across these 3 dimensions with the 2 subdimensions can get a little complicated for the user. So here's what you get in terms of your demonstrated level of effectiveness as a user. You can see the green are the scales and the white here are the subscales. And so you have continuous learning with the 2 subscales, self-awareness and exploration and so forth. But on this triangle, you only map your 3 scales. How much of a learner are you? How well you interpersonally engage, and how resilient or hardy you are. So here's what you have to map, and then here's the profile. So if you're an observer, you're more interested in analyzing others than you are in forming relationships. And so they have names for these various profiles. And here I said the traditionalist, satisfied with preferring familiar people, apprehensive in new situations. Yeah, my son, opposite of me. Well, if you have to take a score to find out your children are not like you, that's kind of sad, but I was surprised by that. Then you actually have the capacity to set goals for yourself across these. And this is excitement part of the mediation for dispositions. Very structured way of leveraging your high skills and compensating for your low skills. So I think this is a wonderful part of this. Underutilized, and I intend to utilize it more, making your personal development plan. In these areas, what are your weakest? What are your goals? What are your tactics? What support can you engender, and how accountable you are? So this interpreting the score, I think, is the essence of a mediated learning experience, because most test takers need help with interpreting the chart and constructing their profile. And this feedback as a vehicle is what the content is. So I'm going to separately now analyze the concept of what is in the sociocognition of the mediated learning experience in the actual reporting of the content and mediating the self-knowledge they're attaining by taking this. And so the feedback they get from the vehicle itself helps them evaluate their own sociocognition in terms of their own personality variables. So they have capacity for continuous learning, what their capacity for interpersonal engagement, and what is their hardiness. The modality of the mediation, not of the instrument itself, but of the mediated self-knowledge that they get from doing the charting and doing the personal goals, that is both verbal, graphic, tabular, and schematic. So you can see the modality jumps from all that verbal, taking the actual scale and responding to the mediation. So that's kind of a challenge, I think, for the mediator. As we go through that phase, they have to generally remember what the questions were, have a layman's interpretation of terms, and then the history of their own personal goal setting. If they were never good at setting goals, they're not going to be that great as, late adolescents, early adults. But as you elaborate, they have to have the ability to combine the questions, understand how questions form scales, how tables form graphs, how graphs form a profile, and then how a profile informs their identity. And then later on, output using the scales to create their specific and developmental goals. So I think that there's, as I said, for myself, there's great excitement in pushing the mediation idea forward and really developing this part, which I think I've tended to say, okay, now you do this and have at it. Because their operations in their mind, they're going to have to identify, encode, decode, differentiate the different scales, integrate the subscales, and then represent them to themselves in their mind, do some inferential thinking, analogical thinking, and then synthesize and extrapolate this information to the goal piece. So it's quite elaborate. The complexity, though, depends on their own mental flexibility. It depends on their experience with tables and graphs, how well they can encode their terminology, and their response to the mediated learning environment. Not every adult wants to share their goal setting with somebody else, apparently not with their instructor. So that's something depending on the prior relationship you can set up. And I said, I've had the great privilege of being able to have extensive and intensive relationships because I see my graduate students in several classes. And so since they're there for about a year and a half, I can get to know them. And so it doesn't have to be a one-shot mediation in one course, but we can continue to refer to this and ask them how they're working on it. So really in the future, that's my next level of research. So the level of abstraction still remains low to medium. And the level of efficiency, I think there will be some effective practice across the three scales because they require individual developmental goal setting. So I think by the third set of goals, the hardiness scale, they could get better at goal setting and understanding the transference between the scale and the goals they're expected to set up. So in conclusion, I see little value in trying to create a cognitive map across the whole field of intercultural competence. I think it's too complex and differentiated a field. It's like saying, I'm going to create a cognitive map of everything the mind can do. I think that's kind of a self-defeating task. But to map a specific and well-validated instrument, and then the intervention sequence, I think that's a worthwhile endeavor. The IES, the Intercultural Effectiveness Scale, and I brought a copy if people want to see it, I think it's well constructed, it's easy to deliver, and it's packaged with this really well-presented mediated learning opportunity. So the MLE, I have to digress, Ferris Stein has entire books on the mediated learning experience. The entire instrumental enrichment progress from Ferris Stein has extensive training on how to create and sustain the MLE. So if you think about MLE, that's really what Ferris Stein continually innovated. And it's very connected to Vygotsky. In fact, I found out during the trainings that, Alex Kazulin had translated the original Vygotsky I think Pavlenko started translating Vygotsky for Jim Lantoff, but originally Alex Kazulin was the one who brought it to Michael Cole. And Alex Kazulin is the research director for Ferris Stein's foundation. So there's a lot of connection between the mediated learning experience as originally conceptualized by Vygotsky and the tremendous forward documentation and experimentation and research that the Ferris Stein Foundation has done on that. So I think the cognitive map really translates very well to this, and it helps us to identify the sticking points that we might have. The MLE is associated with interpreting the score in the IES, and it's really useful in mediating dispositions, that the client or the student has to want to do this. You can become a TESOL educator, not want to leave the country. You can be a TESOL educator and not want to form interpersonal relationships with people who are different than you. That's a big tragedy in our field. We give them the knowledge, we give them the skills, and then we wind them up and they don't go anywhere because they're not disposed to want that. And so this is a cognitive tool to influence the change because it is a dynamic assessment. You're not only assessing the disposition, but you're mediating the learning of that disposition while you're taking the assessment. So it's really the essence of a dynamic assessment. And it links directly to personal analysis and professional goal setting. So it's mediating the metacognition of the disposition as well, and the metalinguistics of it. So I think that when done with the MLE, is going to add a lot to our field. So thank you very much.